Okay, there we go. Let's do it. Okay, Colin, so a question for you. How did you get into research relating to child protection?
Well, in one sense, it was a bit of a fluke. I'd done some work on suicide and began to modify a method of measuring changes in suicide rates, which, of course, as a psychiatric social worker, was very important. And at the time, I'm talking about the 1980s, and at the time, we're hearing big cases going wrong with child abuse deaths and so on, and social workers being hopeless and so forth. And there was one particular case in 1991, and I felt, oh gosh, can't we get it right? Because the media was wanting the death of, shoot all social workers are hopeless at child protection, negligent, and so on. So just as a matter of thought, well, where were we with child abuse deaths, etc.? And of course, this might surprise students, that in the 60s, child abuse wasn't an issue. Indeed, there's almost a diversion. In 1962, a team led by Professor Kempe, a paediatrician in the States, invented a phrase, baby battering syndrome. We all thought, well, nobody noticed anything. Then in 1968, Dr. Selwyn Smith had a small caseload of baby battering in the BMJ. And we thought, what is this man talking about? Because nobody knew anything about it. And I was then a principal psychiatric social worker in Leeds and ended up on Yorkshire television saying, well, of course, it's typical American hyperbole. You can be very pompous when you're young. Typical American hyperbole. I use the word hyperbole rather than hype, because, that may happen in America, but it doesn't happen in Britain. And then suddenly we began to look, and in the 70s, it did. So in 1970, 72, 74, on average, Great Britain had the 4th highest child abuse-related deaths in the Western world, in the 21 Western countries. So when I heard about this bad case again, I thought, well, how are they doing at a national level? So not with much enthusiasm, I started analysing the data, the death rates, from 1970 to 72 to then it was 1985, 87, because you're always 4 or 5 years behindhand. And to my delight, we'd reduced child abuse-related deaths considerably. In fact, we were now halfway in the league table. So I published this in the British Journal of Social Work in 1992. It caused a furore. Absolute outrage. Here was good news, and everybody was shouting about it, namely, particularly the NSPCC, who had an advert, send us £15 to save a child's life dying every day. And of course, with my figures, the international figures, they had to change their advert, send us £15 to save a child's life dying every week. And they were so angry about it, they then had a counter paper in the British Journal of Social Work in 1993 saying why all was wrong. And therefore, I had failed to realise that a lot of child abuse related deaths would be hidden, which of course makes sense. People who've damaged their kids are not likely to be willing to acknowledge it. So there's undetermined deaths. All these undetermined deaths may contain child abuse deaths. I thought, well, they might be right. So I didn't publish for years. But over time, both had come down, and now Britain was in the bottom third because we continue to improve. So in this sense, Richard, you and I, if you remember, we did a paper, we've been looking at child abuse-related deaths over the years to find been coming down steadily and regularly.
Yeah.
And indeed, our paper in Child Abuse Review in 2019, we compared ourselves with the rest of the Western world. And for straightforward child abuse related deaths 0 to 4, we're the bottom in the league table. If you include undetermined deaths, then we're 3rd from the bottom. And of course, are the undetermined deaths really containing all hidden abuse deaths? Who knows? But the key thing was we come right down. Now, the interesting thing about that is we also compared general child mortality. And our child abuse deaths compared with our child mortality deaths were actually a bigger reduction than our child mortality deaths, which had come down. But more about that later. So there I'd done, in a way, purely epidemiological stuff. What did I know about child protection? Because whilst in the field of mental health, occasionally, just occasionally, you came across a case which involved overt child abuse and child protection issues, but not very often, because we're all living in our little silos. So it had happened actually in Dorset. The Dorset probation, because there's a new scandal came in the late 70s, and that was about child sexual abuse. Sorry, in the early 80s. In the late 70s, early 80s, child sex abuse was not on the radar. And suddenly it became an issue. And there's a man called Jimmy Savile, you know about that later. And suddenly the Home Office is running around, what can they do? So the NSPCC said, we can treat and cure child sex abusers. And there was a unit based, shall we say, in Wessex, under the auspices of the probation service. So they said, would I evaluate it? Because it had been running for 2 years. Because, of course, you know, are we part of the solution or part of the problem? Can you pause the recording? Because there's...
No, it's all right, it's mine. You carry on.
Ah, sorry, I'm panicking. Sorry, right. So I went along to this unit to find a very strange group of people, and I must be very careful lest it gets libelous. And I wasn't at all happy, essentially as a psychiatric social worker, as a practitioner, what these people were doing. And their main therapy was group therapy with all these sex offenders, all convicted sex offenders. I wanted to speak to these chaps individually. I wasn't allowed near them. And we had a big row with the people organising this. And I had to say to them rather brutally, look, I'm here to evaluate your service. Now, if you don't let me evaluate, I have to say you're not valuable and therefore you'll be closed down. Because, you know, you cannot say to your sponsors, you've agreed to be evaluated, etc.
Yeah.
So very reluctantly, they let me in, but not the way I wanted to do. So to stop a lot of rows, I simply looked at records. But what I did do, I designed a questionnaire. And one of the few features on the questionnaire, every one of these men agreed with this statement. Now, this is a very bad question, but you think about it. These are sex abusers in group therapy. Group therapy, the group sessions were helpful to me, but to be honest, for most of the other guys, it was a turn on.
Right.
That was written in a confidential report in 1995. We now know that's true with recent research. Now, this got me really intrigued because I was looking at these men and thinking, why behaving like this, etc. The police, Dorset police, heard about my efforts with the NSPCC, and what they liked was obviously I was reporting what I found, and they liked my tough response. This is about outcome. I'm not interested in management ideas. I'm not interested in the ethos and the prestige of organisations. I'm interested in the outcome for children. So the Dorset police said, will you come and have a look at our police records on child sex abuse? Because they've got all these new records and they had no clue what to do with them. So I went along and examined these police records, which were, you know, this meant turning bulky police records into kind of manageable and quantitative measures. But the crucial thing was, Richard, this was all based on court facts. So I got their demography, their age, their backgrounds, what offences they'd done, but crucially, not just child sex offences, but any other offences, because you get the person's complete record. And what we found was there were, broadly speaking, 3 types of sex abuser you could assign based on their criminality, namely the crimes they committed. About 50% of these men were, belittling anything, sex-only men. And all they'd done was actually had a sex involvement with a child. Almost all of them were outside the family. This was in swimming baths, this was in a cinema, this was in a park and things like this. And most of it was, frankly, quite casual. And that's all they did. These men had no other crimes at all. And when we looked in the recording of what the children were saying, the kids under 7 just were saying, this is cheeky, this is naughty, this is rude. They didn't really feel anything was happening, and this was never reported, but it's time we did. We realized that, in fact, the kids were probably more damaged by the inquiry and, crucially, the medical examination than actually the fleeting incident. Then there was a middle group of men, again, mainly casual sex with small young children, but also had other forms of crime, burglary, car theft, etc., etc. And then there's about 12%, and these were really very difficult. We call them multi-criminal, violent child sex abusers, and they were just that. All had got at least 1 conviction for a serious violence offence, either actual bodily harm or grievous bodily harm, plus a sex offence against a child, and very often against women too, and other forms of crime. And of course, you looked at these men and they were living very chaotic lives. Hampshire liked this, and I took on Hampshire's data, which beautifully matched Bournemouth, Dorset, the old Dorset, you know, the big geographical county of Dorset. And it is, of course, the largest consecutive study of men convicted of sex offences, 348 in Britain. It's not been repeated. One rather odd thing, which we can now be brave enough to report back to you, there was another 100 cases which had started off as a complaint, invariably from the wife, but most of these cases were from middle-class homes. And then the wife or the female partner withdrew the allegations or refused to be a witness. And this made us look again, and this is a real problem, because it made me realise that we, the authorities, that's the right word to use, the police only know the convicted men, which was 65% of men extra family offenders, whereas the worst problem of child abuse of any kind occurs within the family and the intimacy of a relationship. This then, the Dorset were very pleased. They said, will you have a look at our murders? Really cheerful subject, isn't it? Really cheerful subject. So again with Hampshire. So I looked at 10 years of murder in 6K population, and to find who killed their children. And this was pretty horrendous. Now, one of the things, I'll try to split it if I can. When I was looking at these case files, these police records, I'm not sure I should be telling you this, but you want it honestly. I was sat in the PA's office of the Deputy Chief Constable of Dorset, and I was going through these case files because I wasn't allowed to take them out, because of course this was an internal audit. And suddenly I came to a file with photographs, and there was this this big, well, a young man of about 26. He looked like a rugby player, big burly guy, looked like a second row forward, really big lad. And then there was photographs of what he did to a 3-year-old girl. I'm afraid I lost it in the office. I think I might have been swearing. I was just so shocked because up to that time it had all been an intellectual exercise. I was taking rather horrendous manuscript, and turning it into numbers, and therefore distancing myself, not realizing that there's a child at the end of this. And there I saw this guy, what this dreadful man had done to the children. George Pothecary, the assistant chief constable, came in and said, "Colin, what the hell's going on?" And I said something to him, I can't use the words. How do your lads keep their hands off a man like this? Because I was just frankly so outraged. And he said, "Well, Colin, frankly, with difficulty, but I'm glad you see what we have to deal with." Now, this is about reality. And this shook me because it stopped me being ivory towered and being overly objective. And this led later to me writing a paper I never thought I would write, because I suddenly realized, going back to the three groups of sex abusers, the violent multi-criminal, comparing with those, and then looking at the murders, I suddenly thought, because I got the history of these men in the police records, I realized this was a kind of progression. So I'm afraid we wrote a paper in 1996 in British Journal of Social Work, which actually got me into trouble with The Guardian. You know, I'm a lefty trendy Guardian reader, but there we are. And what we said was this: men who commit a crime of violence against a woman or a man, sorry, a woman or a child, plus a sex offence, he should be considered for a renewable sentence. So that if the offence is in front of the court warrants a prison sentence, and he's committed sex crimes against a woman or a child and violence, he should be considered for a renewable sentence, and we should consider that we ask him, before we let him out, is he safe to let him out? And of course the Guardian said, how can he prove that? I said, well, I'm not quite sure. And what I recommended, Richard, I'm horrified to say it in public, I'm virtually recommending a preventative detention. Now, all the moral arguments, all the legal arguments against preventative detention are mammoth. You could build a library on it. That is until you see what a 26-year-old rugby player did to a 3-year-old child. Now, I never thought I'd ever say anything like that. And this is why The Guardian suggested that I was a little bit reactionary on my suggestions. And I did say to her, well, look, to be called reactionary by The Guardian would get me a safe seat in any Tory constituency. But one has to try to laugh at it because it was so shocking. Because see, I'm actually saying two things, Richard. I'm saying that these guys and this casual sex, these are sad people. And sometimes it may be the way we, the authorities, treat these younger kids in particular. We may have done more damage to them than, because what is sexual abuse? We use the phrase, and it is so many layered levels. Now, let's stick to this level bit, because you and I did a study, which actually we did something very naughty. We got so frightened by it, we sat on it for 2 years. We'd published now our child murder, we'd published our child sex abuse, we'd published the lock 'em up paper, which is a dreadful thing to say. And I repeat, you have to report what you find. A lot of people, I'm sure, will disagree with me, but it's when you cross over and what the practitioner knows about the reality. Yeah, the reality of poverty. Yeah. You know, these politicians thinking, oh, talk about numbers, but the reality of longitudinal poverty and intergenerational poverty. a local authority, which will have to be nameless, well, actually from the north, was it, did they ring you or did they ring me?
I think it was you this time, yeah.
Yeah. And what they've got some of their social workers were complaining to their local safeguarding committee. They're worried about some of their teenagers sexually abusing younger children, and they were very concerned, and they didn't know what to do about it. So they wanted to know, could we do some research, try to make some sense? Because the social workers were very worried, they didn't want to inadvertently label a 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old boy a child sex abuser. They wouldn't speak to us. So what they had to do, if you remember, we eventually developed an anonymous questionnaire based on research of types of behavior coming from child sex abusers. And if you remember, you and I got shocked.
Yeah.
We said we couldn't, we had to keep this quiet, had to be massively confidential. Because, of course, what we recognised, we called the paper Youth Who Pose Sexual Risk. And if you remember, these young men, they're all men, of course, or lads, had the worst background you and I had ever seen. Was it 40% had been in care, 60% had been excluded, something like half of them had witnessed domestic violence, something like 3/4 had been physically abused. Nothing could have been worse. They'd had 3 or 4 different parents by the age of 7. The most disturbed group of people we ever saw. And we thought, what on earth can we do about this? And of course, the key, what it does, though we never published it in this way, was anybody getting the wrong idea, oh, children coming home in care, we're breeding our own child sex abusers. And we said there needs to be a debate about this, because this is where you need to understand the child, not the child they abuse, but the child who's doing the abusing first, because when we looked at it, quite a number of them were involved a younger child 2-3 years. And where there was no bullying, we suddenly realized that these kids were all in care. And in one sense, perhaps it's the wrong word to use, but from the children's point of view, they're giving mutual comfort. Mutual comfort. And this really explains why sometimes these adult abusers pick up these girls who are running away from care, give them attention, a lot of affection, lots of goodies. And the child, these young people, don't feel they're being abused because they understand it. They're being exploited massively. And from your point of my view, any adults realise that these men are absolute brutes and are exploitative and should go to prison, because that's really criminal. But the kid at that time doesn't understand it, and therefore very often protects their abusers. And this, when we looked at our 17-year-olds, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, you suddenly realize these kids are damaged and they're looking for some form of attention and affection. And that's a problem that it's almost...
Yeah, no, there's not the debate, isn't it? It's a very sensitive area. I think it's hugely problematic, and people need to feel safe to have that conversation. It's incredibly tough, and I know that from a number of people that I've spoken with, practitioners and managers, and talked about caseloads and the recognition that within the caseload there are a number of young people who they have a concern about. And you're right, it's very difficult to engage in that conversation more widely than the one-to-one.
And then when we looked at research, and this is where I think you're right, we need this debate, because when you look at research on child sex abuse, a significant proportion of these people have been abused themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this is where it gets really problematic. And I normally want to play down big numbers, which, make a kind of headline, etc. But I'll give you one case because it taught me so much. Looking at these 100 cases who withdrew, and all of them were middle class, etc. Some years ago, leave it at that, I had a lady referred to me because when I was still a small caseload in my mental health caseload, it was an unresolved bereavement depression. Sometimes you get a bereavement and it's allied to a depression and doesn't seem to resolve. And this lady was in her 50s, professional lady. She'd been married a second time, running her own business, a very competent all-round kind of person. And I saw her in the department, and she was telling me that she's still grieving about her father, but her problem was she couldn't grieve about her father. So her father had died 2 years before, but she couldn't grieve. And this has somehow blocked her. And it was damaging her relationship with her second husband, and it was damaging her ability to concentrate at work, and it was damaging her business. And I spent a long first 55-minute hour trying to understand. And all she was telling me was just what a wonderful father he was.
Yeah.
So a second interview, and occasionally I got hints that he wasn't always stable, and sometimes a little unfair, because she was the eldest, but she was special, and sometimes she was treated a bit unfairly. And I wasn't sure where this was going. And then the third interview was the crisis, and it taught me so much. My father loved me. No, sorry, I'm saying, but your father loved you. You know, why can't you grieve? And I just had to put it, I can't understand, Mrs. Smith, why you can't grieve. Because after all, from all you said, your father did this, your father did that, he paid for this, he paid for that, you know, he was close to you, etc., etc., etc. And whatever I did, I touched something, and suddenly this woman changed before my very eyes. She became angry and started crying. How could he love me when he couldn't hear the cries of his own 9-year-old daughter when he raped me? I was stunned, absolutely stunned. And there was, I don't know how long the silence went on, and she was just quietly crying. And this was the breakthrough. This sex abuse, this monstrous sex abuse, continued until she was 16. And here was the problem. By the time she got into her late teens, her relationship with her father, it had become a sexual relationship. When the mother discovered it, classically, the mother blamed the daughter. The mother blamed the daughter. Nothing was ever said again in that family. The marriage of the parents continued. She was seen as the bad daughter. And when she went to university, she never went home again. But the scars. And that to me was what I think really is probable. The worst form of child abuse, both emotional, physically, but particularly sexually, probably occurs with the intimacy of the family. And the damage is the child often feels responsible, and even when it's exposed, is often blamed. And this is one form of child protection which I think we need to get to understand the reality. And I've never forgotten that lady.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
I'm pleased to say that she was able to grieve and begin to blame herself less, because that was the problem. Because of course she did love her father, and that ambivalence, and she was, you know, really was quite split. But there's one final form of child abuse we must talk about, and we'll talk about our 2019 paper, and that's child abuse deaths and child mortality. I'm sure most students are not surprised that if you go into African countries or Latin American countries, ordinary mortality rates are way higher than the Western world.
Yeah.
But let's look at the Western world. And let's look at the richest country in the world, the United States of America. The United States of America. Their child mortality rates, 0 to 4, are the highest in the Western world. Why is that? Lots of complicated issues. But mainly strongly correlated is income inequality, what you might call relative poverty. Because what we found is, using World Bank data, the gap between the top 10% of incomes and the bottom 10% of incomes. In America, it's 17 times. We're only talking about the top 10% of incomes and the bottom 10% of incomes. The second country on income inequality is Portugal, but their child mortality is a little lower. The third country in the widest relative poverty in the Western world is, it begins with United Kingdom. It's a bloody scandal. We've got the 5th highest level of child mortality in the Western world. It's a scandal. In this century, every Western nation has reduced its child mortality. We've reduced ours less well than 9 other countries. But when we look at child abuse related deaths, we've reduced our death rates on this abuse side. Thank you, probation, police, health visitors, paediatricians, GPs, the coordination. Our child protection has never been better. But the other hidden child abuse is the way we let poverty kill children, and poverty does kill children. If you look at America, the income inequality, if you look at countries like Sweden, Finland, Japan and Norway, which is the most equal country, literally they got less than half the income inequality of the Americans, and they've got more than half the death rate of America. On the other hand, you will hear about this later, when we look at adult deaths, our NHS is doing pretty well and actually significantly doing better than others. But children, and the link between child poverty, and of course child poverty is intergenerational. It blocks education, it blocks access to decent diet and so forth. People get trapped in this continuous conveyor belt of misery and poverty. And at the extreme end is child mortality. So when we can talk about when we will have a social worker making a mistake, and God help us, a child will die, and the media goes mad, why is it the media never talk about your research, Richard, and my research showing that Britain's got the 3rd worst relative poverty in the Western world and the 5th highest child mortality? The two go together. So let's try to end on a positive note. Britain is an unequal society, so you'll need different kind of change in social work. So we can't do anything about that, but as citizens we can think about it, and that is another dimension perhaps for other kind of social and political scientists. But in terms of child protection, I can say with a degree of confidence that we won't win all our cases, but British social work has never been more effective in reducing the extreme consequences of child abuse neglect.
One of the most effective services in the world. Quite right, Colin. It's a wonderful note to finish on. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colin.
That's it.